Well, we're going to start a new topic today, topic 2, and it begins with topic 2.1, species and populations. So first of all, let's define what actually is a species. It's a group of organisms that can interbreed, and more importantly, they have to produce fertile offspring. They cannot be sterile. So let's take a look at an example. This is a mule. A mule is actually a combination of a horse and a donkey. Is this now a new species? Well, if it were a new species, that means that two mules could interbreed. They would have to be fertile and create more mules. This cannot happen, though. Mules are sterile. In order to get more mules, you need to keep breeding horses and donkeys. And the reason why you can create a mule, even though they're sterile, is that the chromosomal arrangement of horses and donkeys is similar enough that you can make this work in meiosis. Here's another one. I actually saw this recently when I was taking my dog out to the park, and I saw this, looked like a wolf just coming in there, and his owner came up and said, don't worry, it's actually a wolf dog. And I said, wolf dog, what's that? It's a combination of a dog breeding with a wolf. Yeah, it can happen. Their chromosomal arrangements are fairly similar. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this actually is fertile. You can breed wolf dogs. So does that mean it's a species? Well, biologists, the jury's out on that. A lot of biologists are starting to think that wolves and dogs are really the same species. They're just different varieties of the same thing. Chicken dog? Obviously not. How about this one? This is a liger. You can breed a lion with a tiger. This is not a photoshopped picture here. This is real. But it's sterile, so it's not really considered to be a species. Obviously, tiger shark. Just kidding. No. Okay, now that we've defined what a species is, let's talk about their locations and their roles, or what we like to call as habitats and niches. A habitat's the environment where the species lives, and the niche is the role that it performs in that habitat. Now, I know it's really easy to think about a niche as being a job, like a beaver would have a job, but it's more where they fit into the food chain and so forth. Now, niches can be thought about in two different ways. Fundamental niche is theoretically what the animal or plant or any type of organism, what they should be doing. Realized niche is actually what's happening. So we might say, for example, that with a coyote, their fundamental niche is they should be out in the scrubland, in the high desert and so forth, and they should be hunting for squirrels and so forth. But as they've occupied more urban areas, they're starting to raid garbage cans. That's not really their fundamental niche, but that's their realized niche. That's what they've actually adapted to doing. The exclusion principle is a very important idea, and it's often misunderstood. No two similar species can occupy the same niche for an extended time. And so, if we define all organisms as having a different habitat and a different niche, or else they'd be the same species, right? Then we have to conclude that in order to maintain that relationship, no two similar species can occupy the same niche. So if you had, for example, two very similar birds living in the same tree and eating the same food and performing the same behaviors and so forth, that wouldn't last very long because you'd have competition, right? One would eventually lose and one would eventually win. And what Darwin has told us, and we'll get to this later on, is that one of the birds will adapt to perhaps eating a different type of food or living in a different part of the tree so they can coexist. They had to switch their habitats and niches a little bit. Big principle behind what we'll later on discuss as natural selection. I just want to, by the way, before I go on here, say that it has to be two similar species. So you could have a bear and a wolf come down to the river, both hunting for a salmon and so forth, and you would say, well, they're occupying the same habitat and niche. Not really, though, because they're very, very different types of animals. What are the factors that determine all this? Well, there's abiotic factors, that is non-living, and biotic factors. So abiotic factors, those are easy to mention: temperature, sunlight, or shade, the amount of nesting areas, salinity, rainfall. I suppose you could also say elevation of where the area is. You could say whether the area is flat or whether it's steep on a hillside. Lots of things you could bring in there. Biotic factors, living. Are there predators? Are there mates? Diseases? What's the availability of food, and so forth? Based on these things, we have interactions. So now we know what a species is. Now we know what the factors are that determine their habitat and niche. What are the ways they can come together? Well, they could come together, for example, in predation. One could simply be hunting the other, right? Or herbivore, an animal could be eating a plant. But these sort of relationships are not really long-term relationships. So, kind of silly to think about it, but a lion hunts a zebra. Is that a relationship between the two? Well, not really. Not as far as the zebra is certainly concerned. So what we're talking about is, what are long-term established relationships between various organisms? We would call these things symbiosis, long-term relationships. And there's three types I'd like you to be aware of. Mutualism, where everybody gets a benefit. Commensalism, where one gets a benefit and the other really doesn't care. And parasitism, where one benefits and the other really loses. For example, mutualism, both benefit. Zooxanthellae and coral. So coral is actually an animal. I know it looks like it's a rock, but it's actually an animal. And coral cannot move. It's not mobile. So how does it get its food? Well, there is a protista, a type of algae, which actually lives inside the coral, which makes it look kind of greenish-brown. And it can do photosynthesis, so it can produce food to feed the coral. And in return, the coral gives it a home, a place to live. And by the way, when you've seen coral that looks very white, it actually is because the zooxanthellae has died, and the coral is dying too, so that's not what it should look like. Commensalism. You may have noticed that whales tend to be covered with barnacles. So the barnacles get a free ride on the whale, and they also get leftover food as the whale passes through the water. Whales, as far as we know, don't seem to mind. They don't really get any benefit, but it doesn't seem to hurt them. Parasitism. So let's use one that's not animals, just so you're aware that it can exist in other organisms. Let's use some plants. A strangler vine, which will wrap itself around a tree and climb up it. And it gets bigger and bigger, and actually is like a snake. It can actually kind of strangle and suffocate the tree, and eventually it will kill it. Now, the goal of parasitism is not to kill the host organism. That doesn't happen in the short term, but long term, yeah, that could end the relationship. So let's look then how the population of a species will change based on these factors. This is what we typically think of as a population curve. It has a lag phase where it takes a little bit of time to get going. Then as all the factors kick in, we get an exponential phase. Transitional, it slows down, and then stationary, it reaches its carrying capacity. So the way to think about curves is that the rate of change has to do with the factors. So access to the factors here would be difficult. Then everybody's in full speed as we have full access. Now something's becoming limited over here, and that's why it's leveling off. Let's think about an example here. This is what they often refer to as the founder effect. Suppose that two rabbits get dumped on an island by themselves. So you have a very low population, and they start to breed. But it's difficult for them to breed. They have trouble finding food. They have to build their nests. They're getting used to the island. They have lots of predators there. Then as the population of rabbits increases, it's easier for them to find each other, to build nests. They know where their food situation is. They know how to get away from the predators. everything is in abundance there, but as the population grows too high, food starts to get shortage. We then start to have diseases which impact the population of rabbits, and the overall population levels off. Remember that the steepness of a curve has to do with the rate. Even though the population is much higher up here, the rate of change is very, very low. That's typically what we would call an S-curve. There are actually J-curves, which are totally exponential populations. A bacterial population might look like this, but for most of this course, we're pretty much just going to deal with an S-curve.